Welcome to podcast Sarah and Michael.
Welcome to today's deep dive. I want you to just imagine stepping off a plane into the cool air of a Beijing night.
Yeah, quite a scene.
Right. It's late Tuesday, May 19th, 2026. The tarmac is brilliantly illuminated, the red carpet is rolled out, and, well, Russian President Vladimir Putin has just touched down.
And this isn't just some routine photo op,
No, definitely not. It's his very first foreign trip of the entire year. And today, we are looking at exactly why an isolated leader's desperate trip to Beijing is actively rewriting the rules of global trade.
Because it really is keeping a war machine running and circumventing those Western sanctions.
Exactly. So our mission today is to dissect a big stack of recent updates. We've got everything from quick daily dispatches to some really in-depth analysis from BBC News Thai.
Right, to figure out how the mechanics of global power are shifting right under our feet.
Yeah. Because, for you listening, it is a critical moment to analyze. It really forces us to look past the official press releases, right?
Totally. I mean, when you look closely at who is standing where, and more importantly, the economic leverage they hold when they shake hands,
Which is huge.
you realize that the old map of global alliances has just been completely redrawn. And this specific week, in May 2026, puts that new map fully on display.
Okay, let's unpack this, because we have to start by looking at the sheer gravity of where Putin's arriving. Beijing right now isn't just a capital city.
No, it's operating like the undisputed center of the geopolitical universe.
Right. And Putin is actually kind of late to the party.
Yeah, he really is.
Just days before his arrival, Donald Trump was in Beijing meeting with Xi Jinping, which, by the way, was the first U.S. presidential visit to China in almost a decade.
Right, and Trump came out calling the talks, quote, highly successful.
While Xi called them a historical milestone, I mean, they were hammering out everything from the Iran war to massive trade deals.
Yeah, there's talk of China agreeing to buy like 200 Boeing planes and maybe $17 billion in U.S. agricultural products, though, China hasn't officially confirmed those exact numbers yet.
Right. And just to be clear, we're impartially reporting what the sources say here. We aren't taking any political sides. But it's not just the U.S. that's there, is it?
Not at all. The diplomatic traffic jam is staggering. You look at the flight logs, and you have the UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer, Mark Carney from Canada.
Both trying to ease bilateral tensions, yeah.
Exactly. You've got Friedrich Merz from Germany, the leaders of Finland, South Korea, Vietnam, all flooding in.
While our sources note a very specific behavioral shift from Xi Jinping, basically his own state visits abroad have ground to a halt.
He's just staying home.
The mountain is coming to Muhammad, right? But I want to push back on the idea that this is just China being some honest broker.
Okay.
Because from the outside, it looks like everyone, even these bitter rivals, being dragged to Beijing against their will. Like, why is the entire world suddenly compelled to converge on Xi Jinping's doorstep? It can't just be about finding a neutral table.
No, it isn't. If we connect this to the bigger picture, it's about raw, unavoidable economic architecture. China has actively positioned itself as the indispensable bottleneck of the global economy.
A bottleneck.
Right. In a world full of localized conflicts and disrupted supply chains, leaders are looking at their own domestic survival.
They need stuff.
Exactly. Whether you need cheap goods to fight inflation, green tech for climate goals, or just a massive market for your exports, the supply chains run through China.
So it's an accumulation of leverage.
You simply cannot ignore them, no matter how fiercely you oppose them on other issues. The economic floor dictates the diplomatic ceiling.
Wow. And, well, no one needs that economic floor more desperately right now than Vladimir Putin, which brings us to the core of his agenda for this summit.
Right. The real reason he's there.
The Kremlin statements are notoriously vague, as usual. They just say the talks cover, quote, important and sensitive issues.
Which means everything and nothing.
Exactly. But looking at the analysis from BBC News Thai, the actual mechanisms of this meeting come down to two major things: securing energy revenue and physically sustaining the war in Ukraine.
Right. Let's look at the mechanics of that energy strategy first. Because Western sanctions have basically blockaded Russia's traditional revenue in Europe.
So they have to pivot east.
They do. And the absolute centerpiece of this survival strategy is the Power of Siberia 2 pipeline.
Which is a massive project.
Huge. If they finalize it, this infrastructure would pump 50 billion cubic meters of Russian gas to China every single year.
But wait, building a massive overland pipeline through harsh terrain takes years, right? and billions of dollars.
Yeah, easily a decade.
So why is this specific pipeline the hell both countries are willing to die on right now? Russia needs cash today, not in 2035.
Well, Russia needs the guarantee of future revenue to borrow against today, but for China, the urgency is entirely strategic and geographic.
How so?
The BBC analysis points out the escalating crisis in the Strait of Hormuz. It's a narrow maritime choke point in the Middle East.
Right, where a massive percentage of the world's oil transits.
Exactly. If a conflict completely shuts that strait down, China's ocean-based energy shipments starve.
Right.
Their economy grinds to a halt.
Ah, okay, so it's a physical insurance policy.
Precisely. A direct overland pipeline from Siberia straight into Chinese industrial hubs, it bypasses the oceans entirely.
You can't blockade it with a navy.
Right. So Russia desperately needs a buyer to replace Europe, and China desperately needs a secure energy supply that doesn't rely on vulnerable shipping routes.
It's a perfect convergence of their security interests.
Exactly.
Okay, that explains the gas. But then we have to talk about what China is sending back, because this directly fuels the war in Ukraine.
Right.
The reports show Russia heavily relying on Chinese exports to keep its military going, specifically dual-use goods and drone components.
Yeah.
But officially, Beijing claims absolute neutrality in the Ukraine war.
Yeah.
They say they are a peacemaker. How does that actually work in practice?
It's a real tightrope.
I mean, for you listening, it feels like selling someone flour and sugar, claiming you're just a harmless grocer, while knowing full well your customer is using those ingredients to bake a poisoned cake.
That flour and sugar analogy is actually the perfect way to understand the mechanism of dual-use goods.
Really?
Yeah, because China isn't loading up trains with fully assembled tanks or artillery shells.
Right, because that would cross a line.
It would immediately trigger secondary sanctions from the West and cut China out of the global banking system.
Right.
So instead, they export microcontrollers, navigation sensors, ball bearings, raw telecom gear.
Things that could just as easily go into a civilian washing machine or a commercial airliner.
Exactly. On the customs manifest, it is a completely civilian export.
Wow.
But once it crosses into Russia, that same microcontroller is stripped out and wired into an Orlan reconnaissance drone.
And China can just deny knowing about it.
Yeah, and furthermore, China often uses third-party shell companies in Central Asia to handle the transactions. It totally muddies the paper trail.
So Beijing can just stand up at the UN and say, we adhere to international law, we don't sell weapons.
And strictly, legally speaking, they aren't. They are defending their right to normal trade. But by keeping it in this gray area, China acts as Russia's economic lifeline without crossing explicit red lines.
Which is wild because it shatters this specific media narrative we've been fed for years. We constantly hear the phrase, no limits partnership, to describe Putin and Xi.
Right, the smiles for the camera.
Yeah, they talk about a multipolar world. But when you look at the actual numbers, the idea of an equal partnership completely falls apart.
It's a facade. The BBC piece brings in some incredibly sharp analysis from Alexander Gabiev at the Carnegie Russia-Eurasia Center.
Oh, yeah. His stuff is fascinating.
It really cuts through the diplomatic theater. He points out a massive structural imbalance. Basically, Russia is now completely under China's economic and technological influence.
China dictates the terms.
Yeah, virtually all the terms of their agreements.
Here's where it gets really interesting. The statistic that Gabiev highlights is the one thing I want anyone listening to take away from this today, because it recontextualizes the whole war.
It really does.
China is currently Russia's largest trading partner, right? They are everything to the Russian economy, buying the oil, providing the tech, keeping the lights on.
Absolutely vital to them.
But trade with Russia makes up a mere 4% of China's total international trade. Just 4%.
It's a staggering asymmetry.
It's like a business partnership where one person owns 96% of the company and the other person owns 4%.
Wait.
But they issue these grand press releases pretending they're equal co-CEOs.
Exactly.
The guy with 4% doesn't get to negotiate the price of gas. He takes what he's given.
And that is exactly what we are seeing play out. This raises an important question, though, because Russia simply has no viable alternative market to survive.
They can't pivot back to Europe.
No. And they don't have another buyer with the sheer demand of China. As Gabiev notes, it's about systemic dependency. Russia is increasingly forced to settle its trade in Chinese yuan, meaning they depend on Chinese currency policies. They rely on Chinese telecom infrastructure.
So if Beijing suddenly cut trade, Russia's economy would just crater.
Almost overnight. But, if Xi Jinping holds all the leverage, he also has to manage all the risk.
Right, because if you own 96% of the relationship, you own the consequences of what that 4% partner does.
That is the defining dilemma for Xi right now. He is managing a highly volatile asset.
Yeah.
On one hand, he wants to project solidarity against the West. He certainly cannot afford for Putin's regime to collapse.
A fractured Russia with loose nukes on their border.
Right. That's an absolute nightmare scenario for Beijing's national security, so he needs Putin stable. But on the other hand, Xi does not want this war in Europe to trigger a global recession. Remember that 96% of China's trade that isn't Russia?
It's with North America and Europe, right?
Mostly, yes. Developed economies. And China is facing its own domestic economic headwinds right now. Property sector crises, youth unemployment.
So he needs global stability to maintain China's growth.
Exactly. So his strategy is incredibly precise. He has to prop up Putin just enough to keep him from falling out of a window.
Wow.
But not so much that it triggers a catastrophic economic war with the rest of the world.
It's a dizzying high-wire act.
Yeah.
And what makes it even more complex is that Xi isn't just balancing Russia and Europe. He's simultaneously managing these really aggressive moves from the United States right in his own backyard.
This is where the timeline of events becomes really important to look at.
Exactly. Let's look at the dispatch from the Bangkok Biz News, dated May 21st. So we established that Donald Trump was just in Beijing.
Right. Handshakes, historical milestones, talks of peace.
200 Boeing planes, billions in soybeans. By all accounts, a massive de-escalation of trade tensions.
A huge deal.
But literally days after that summit wraps up, Trump announces that he will be speaking directly with Lai Ching-te regarding U.S. arms sales to Taiwan.
A move that Beijing historically views as a massive red line, a direct threat to its sovereignty.
So what does this all mean? How is this not just blatant hypocrisy that eventually blows up?
That's a good question.
I mean, for a listener trying to follow the daily news, the whiplash is intense. You have the U.S. president smiling in Beijing on a Tuesday and arming Taiwan on a Thursday.
Right.
You have China preaching global peace while literally supplying the microchips for Russian drones. It just feels completely irrational.
Well, it feels irrational if we view international relations through an old Cold War lens, where the world is cleanly divided into absolute friends and absolute foes.
Right, where friction in one area means a total breakdown everywhere.
Exactly. What these sources are showing us is that the modern geopolitical operating system has fundamentally changed. We are now living in a world defined by extreme compartmentalization.
Okay, but how does that actually function in reality? Because human beings don't compartmentalize that well when somebody is arming their enemies.
Human beings don't, no. But massive, highly interdependent economies have to. Extreme compartmentalization means superpowers simply can no longer afford to let friction in one domain stop cooperation in another.
They're just too entangled.
Yes. The U.S. and China are too economically entangled. If they stop trading entirely over Taiwan, both of their domestic economies would face immediate catastrophic depressions.
So they sit down, smile, and negotiate massive deals for airplanes.
Because their domestic populations demand economic stability, but then, in a completely separate, heavily fortified compartment, they fiercely contest geopolitical boundaries.
So the U.S. can basically say, we're selling you planes to keep our factories open, but we're also arming Taiwan to maintain our foothold in the Pacific.
Right.
And China just accepts that.
China accepts the reality of the game because they are playing the exact same game.
Oh, right.
China will buy Russian gas at a massive discount and secretly funnel them drone parts. They compartmentalize that away from their desperate need to keep European export markets open for Chinese electric vehicles.
Wow. So mechanical.
It is deeply pragmatic. It's a ruthlessly mechanical way of conducting foreign policy. Leaders can genuinely shake hands on a multi-billion-dollar trade deal in the morning and coldly prepare for proxy conflict over territory in the afternoon.
Without viewing it as a contradiction.
Exactly. They view it as parallel tracks of national interests.
So the economic floor really does hold up the geopolitical ceiling.
Precisely. It is highly calculated risk management across multiple isolated channels. But, the moment one side lets the tracks cross,
The moment they let the geopolitical anger override the economic necessity.
the whole system crashes.
Which brings a whole new level of clarity to what is happening on that tarmac in Beijing. When we pull all these threads together, we aren't just looking at random diplomatic visits.
No, we are seeing the new architecture of global power. We saw a parade of Western leaders flocking to Xi Jinping, recognizing his grip on global supply chains.
Unavoidable force, yeah.
Yep.
And we saw Vladimir Putin arriving not as an equal partner, but as a deeply dependent client state, just driven by the need to survive Western sanctions.
Right. We explored the physical reality of that Power of Siberia 2 pipeline acting as an insurance policy, and the gray market flow of dual-use goods keeping the war in Ukraine burning.
And crucially, we stripped away the rhetoric of the no-limits partnership.
Yeah, that 4% statistic explains the entire power dynamic.
It really does. It explains why China dictates the terms, why Russia accepts them, and why Beijing can afford to play this massive game of compartmentalization.
Absolutely.
And that's exactly why taking the time to truly understand these mechanics matters. Because when you, listening to this, understand that 4% statistic and you grasp how extreme compartmentalization works,
You stop being a passive consumer of a chaotic news cycle.
you really do. You aren't just reacting to the whiplash of the daily headlines anymore. You're equipped to see the actual strategic chessboard. You understand the hitting why and how behind the moves.
You start to see that the seemingly random handshakes and sudden provocations are deeply calculated plays in a very pragmatic game of survival.
Absolutely. And as we wrap up today's deep dive, I'm going to leave you with one final provocative thought to just mull over on your own.
Go.
We've spent this entire time establishing that Russia's current foreign policy, its military supply chain, its fundamental survival, relies entirely on China acting as its impenetrable lifeline.
Right. China is the 96% holding the 4% afloat.
Exactly. But what happens to the global chessboard? And what happens to Vladimir Putin's regime if China's own economy faces a sudden, unexpected shock?
Oh, wow.
Like, if a domestic crisis forces Beijing to turn entirely inward, and the nation holding that 96% share can simply no longer afford to play the role of global benefactor, who bails out Russia then?
That is the fragile thread holding this entire geopolitical alignment together. If that snaps, the map gets rewritten overnight.
It really does. The floor drops out.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. The next time you see footage of a midnight arrival on a lit tarmac, or read a headline about a contradictory trade deal, you'll know exactly what's really happening in the shadows.
Until next time.
Keep questioning the headlines.